Abi Whitefield is a third-year PhD student in the School of Geography and Sustainable Development at the University of St Andrews here. The STACEES team are familiar with Abi through her work on the university's Environmental Sustainability Board, so it's nice for us to hear more about her research today. Her current research is on the topic of urban deer in Scotland, where she uses a variety of social science methods to better understand the perceptions of a range of stakeholders on the topic. She's interested in the interaction between environmental management, social science, and policy making. And the title of this talk is Scotland's Urban Deer, Understanding Perceptions to Shape Policy Making. And I'll pass over to Abi now.
Oh, thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. Hi everyone, I'm Abi. I'm, as Sarah said, a PhD student in the School of Geography and Sustainable Development. And my PhD is focusing on managing urban deer in Scotland and how this could be used to affect policy making. Oh, and I don't know how to change the slides on here. There we go. So to give you an idea of the content of my presentation, I'm first going to talk specifically about urban wildlife research and deer in Scotland. I'm going to narrow in on urban deer and urban deer management in Scotland, and then focus more specifically on my thesis and the methods I've been using. Oh, there's harder to change the slides on here. Oh, sorry, the slides are now not, okay, there we go. So to give you a little bit of an overview of urban wildlife research, urban wildlife research began emerging in the 1960s, and this was as a response to increased urbanization, so increased human populations expanding urban areas. And this had the potential to increase human-wildlife conflict, so humans and animals were coming into contact more often, and resulting in potential issues there. In Europe, this research has largely focused on urban foxes and wild boar, and in North America, there's been increased attention given to urban deer. But urban deer haven't really received any attention in Europe or in the UK or Scotland. So narrowing in on deer in Scotland, deer are seen to be a very culturally significant species. Deer are often used to advertise the country in marketing. Edward Lance's Monarch of the Glen is seen as a very significant painting, goodness, it's definitely not a photo, which are often used to draw tourists into the country. And surveys have suggested that deer are like one of the top 5 species of significance in Scotland. There are 4 species of deer in Scotland. These are red, roe, fallow, and sika. Red, roe are native, and fallow and sika have been introduced, and that's due to the increase in sporting estates and deer parks. So Balmoralisation, which is where large swathes of the Highlands were converted to sporting estates, and this was in a response to Queen Victoria purchasing the Balmoral estate for her husband, Prince Albert, and creating a sporting estate there, which resulted in loads of industrial magnates and aristocrats purchasing large swathes of land and keeping deer numbers artificially high for ease of stalking. Now, this has created a lot of conflicts. There are foresters and crofters who don't like having such high deer populations. They nibble their plants, they eat their trees, whereas those on deer estates, so those that manage deer estates or those that own deer sporting estates want high populations for ease of stalking. So there's been a lot of conflict, and it has entered the political arena quite a lot. There's been various deer acts, and deer were even included in the Scottish Land Reform Act, which sort of highlights the significance of deer to the country. Now, as I mentioned, deer eat trees, they nibble things, and that has caused some environmental concerns, which has meant that organisations like Nature Scot have been told to increase the deer cull and reduce deer populations. However, historically, this has been a sort of upland focus. Deer have mainly been of concern and of focus to Nature Scot in upland areas, but increasingly these high deer populations are moving into more urban areas. And this is as a result of sort of the deer populations expanding. So deer are being forced due to habitat and food pressures into urban areas. and also because of the urban expansion. So urban areas are expanding, moving into areas that deer already reside in. This has a range of positive and negative impacts on the deer and on humans and on the environment. People love seeing deer. I'm sure those of you who have been lucky enough to spot deer in rural areas or in urban areas probably enjoy seeing them. I know that I do. But there are also negative impacts, such as deer vehicle collisions and issues to do with poaching and deer welfare. There really has been a lack of research and attention on urban deer in Scotland. As I said, this is a subject that hasn't really received much focus. There's been one group of academics that has done some research on peri-urban deer, but that's been it. But recently there has been increased focus called for by the Scottish Government and the Deer Working Group on urban deer and urban deer issues. So this has led to a range of questions about how these deer should be managed. Do we need to monitor and manage urban deer? Are they problematic? Are there enough of them for us to worry about? If we do need to manage them, what kind of methods should we be using? So should we be culling them with lethal methods? Should we be using non-lethal methods like fencing, tree tubing, fertility methods perhaps? There's also questions about who should be responsible for this. So in rural areas, it's quite clear who's responsible for their deer. It's the landowner. Landowners and land managers are the ones with responsibility. But in urban areas, the populations or the areas are very fragmented in ownership. So it's very difficult to decide who should be managing them. And even if you can decide who should be managing them, these pockets of land are so small that it wouldn't really have much effect. So local authorities have been proposed as people who should be having more of a role in this. But is it really their responsibility? Do they have other things that they should be doing? And there are also questions about what the public would think. So this slide kind of highlights the media interest in the topic. There are issues about public perceptions of deer problems, so like Lyme disease, the impacts deer are having, problems with poaching. So there have been deer found like hunted with dogs and guns and left hanging in trees or on fences in areas of Scotland. There are also issues to do with the perceptions of deer management. So Diageo in Leven is one example I like to give of somewhere where they needed to move the deer. They wanted to expand their plant. In 2010, they wanted to create a larger fenced off area, and there was a deer population residing there. And the deer needed to be moved out. And Nature Scott decided that these deer needed to be culled because they tried to move them, but nothing was happening. And this resulted in huge public backlash. As you can see, the Scottish Sun here took an interest in it, and that raised a lot of problems for Nature Scott. A guy there received death threats involved from being involved with it. Another example is Aberdeen Council. They've managed deer for a number of years. When they started and the public got interested, one staff member spent a whole year replying to public concerns from across the world about these deer being culled. So there's definitely a huge public interest in this topic. So narrowing in on my thesis, I really want to understand what the key stakeholders think about urban deer and urban deer management in Scotland. And I also want to understand the perceptions of and barriers to local authority engagement with urban deer management, as they've been seen as a key stakeholder. And the flow diagram kind of highlights the methods I've been using to narrow in on this topic. The first method I used were expert interviews. So these were held online. All of my research has been held online due to the COVID effect. But I interviewed 16 experts. These were a mixture of urban deer stalkers, so people actually on the ground managing deer with various methods, not just stalking. Relevant government bodies like Nature Scott, they have the governmental responsibility for deer in Scotland. Various academics who've published research in the area, and relevant deer organisations like the British Deer Society. So to give you a sort of brief overview of some of the preliminary findings I've had from these interviews, there were lots of questions raised about definitions of deer. So the first is to do with what counts as an urban deer. that you might think that it's easy to decide what an urban area is, but it is, believe me, it's not. The Scottish government has definitions, but these are very contested. There's lots of problems about where does urban become rural. It's a very difficult thing to understand. So then, of course, what counts as an urban deer? Deer move in and out of urban areas. So when do they become urban? There's also questions about the definition of deer management. Deer management is a term that's often used by stalkers or those involved with deer management as just meaning stalking. So they don't take into account all of the other management methods of deer. And that's problematic when talking to the public, because deer management can mean a whole host of things, but some people don't understand it that way. The next thing I noticed was there was a clear focus on the social impacts of deer. So talking about sort of poaching, deer vehicle collisions, disease, and not really a focus on environmental impacts at all. And that really contrasts with the rural sphere of research, which is really focused on these environmental impacts of deer. The third thing I noticed was that culling was seen as sort of the only method of deer management. It was seen as the only way to be successful at managing deer. If fencing was used, it was said that culling would also be used because the fences would become permeable. People cut holes in fences, deer get in, they can get in tiny gaps. So in order to really reduce the deer population, you need to cull. These other methods just move them out of the way. But there are a lot of specific urban issues related to culling. So obviously there's increased amounts of humans in urban areas. That has more problems with conflict and safety. There are methods that deer managers take in urban areas. So they'll call the police before they go and cull a deer, or go out with their guns, so that they don't have a big armed response to them being in the country, or not being in the country, in the urban areas. So that's very different to how they would cull in rural environments. There's also an increased focus on how you look when you're managing deer. So you wouldn't go out in your tweeds in an urban environment. That would be seen quite strangely. So it's more important to, I don't know, have a Nature Scott logo, or be with a branded van, and make sure that you're not acting in a suspicious way. It was also clear that organisations were sort of failing from these interviews. So some people I interviewed mentioned how they tried to engage local authorities with deer management, and there just wasn't any interest. They'd send out surveys or invite them to events, and only a handful would turn up to anything. And there were similar failings found with Nature Scott. So it was felt that they really had historically only focused on these Highland red deer, and failed so far to really engage with these urban problems. And that was causing issues because Nature Scott haven't been encouraging, or were perceived to not be encouraging, local authorities to engage either. The final thing I really noticed was that there were huge data gaps evident. And I've kind of highlighted before that we don't know how many deer there are, we don't know what impacts they're having, we don't know where management is happening or what management is happening. So there's clear issues here of just not having any data on what is happening. The second method I used was a Q methodology study of local authorities. So Q methodology is effectively a sorting exercise. Participants are given lots of statements, which they have to fit into this grid. So on one side, at -5 are the statements that they most disagree with, and 5 are those that they most agree with. So it's sorting their views on these statements in relation to each other. And once they've sorted them, lots of fancy stats happens, and the output of this are different groups of thoughts are identified. I had 30 local authorities that participated in my Q methodology study. There are only 30 local authorities that have deer in Scotland, so I was really pleased to get them all participating, especially because I'd heard how hard it was to get local authorities engaged. So I identified 3 main groups of thought, and the photo is just of my cats covered in me trying to analyse Q methodologies. So the first group of 4 I identified were those that were concerned about deer management. They were concerned about the deer. They felt that deer needed managing, that they were having adverse impacts for humans and for their welfare. But they felt constrained. They didn't feel ready to manage the deer. They felt like they didn't have enough resources or knowledge, but did feel that deer management needed to happen. The second group were those who were unconcerned. They didn't think deer were an issue. They didn't think they were having any impacts, and therefore they thought it was silly to think about managing them. It was just completely unnecessary. The third group were taking responsibility for deer management. They felt like the deer definitely needed managed. They were ready to manage deer and took full responsibility for it. And when looking at the survey I handed out before doing the Q methodology study and the interviews afterwards, it was clear that this group actually were already managing deer. They were the ones that were already engaged and participating. So I think it was clear that there was really different perceptions on those that were already involved. The third method I used was a bit of a bonus method. This was a purely accidental, really. I identified that there might be issues with local councillors blocking policies on deer management. That was noticed during interviews. So I created this survey and implemented it within about a week. It was a very short survey, but got a very high response rate. It found things that were probably quite obvious. So councillors were more supportive of non-lethal methods, and they thought that public perceptions would affect their support of lethal methods more than they would of non-lethal methods. But what was interesting really was that these perceptions were quite significantly shaped by a political party. So those who had perhaps been with the Conservative Party, were Conservative Party members, were more supportive of lethal methods and also more supportive of not telling the public about deer management. Whereas those in the Green Party were very concerned, weren't as supportive of lethal methods, and also felt like the public would need to be told what was happening. My final method is a public survey. So this is a postal survey to 3,000 residents of Scotland. I targeted 3 locations, specific areas of Perth, Aberdeen and Glasgow, which were known to have either historical deer issues or issues emerging. The survey was funded by Forestry and Land Scotland and STACEES. It definitely took up the most of my time and the most resources in packing surveys. A lot of patience of weeks of sitting on the sofa watching Netflix and packing surveys, not the worst job to do. And I had some helpful supporters in helping me bring that to fruition. And I'm hoping to analyse it before Christmas. I'm currently in the stage of doing some chi-square analysis. I calculated yesterday that if I wanted to do chi-square analysis with all of my variables against all of my variables, I'd have to do over 17,000 chi-square analyses. So I need to prioritise and figure out what I'm doing there over the coming couple of weeks. So to summarise, urban deer in Scotland are probably an increasing issue. As I've highlighted, there's so many data gaps. We don't know where they're becoming problematic. A lot of it is done on word of mouth rather than actual data. There's a lack of knowledge. There's been a lack of pressure from the government, from Nature Scot, to do anything about these deer. And there's also a lack of policy. There's no specific policies focusing on urban deer in Scotland. So I'm hoping that my PhD can help fill some of these gaps and to support future policy making. And the photo on here is just a photo of a deer on Buchanan Street in Glasgow. This was during the first lockdown in 2020 and sort of highlights how urban these deer are getting. And a final slide just to show my cat helpers, which I know a few of you are familiar with from meetings. But thank you very much for listening, and I'm excited to hear from Jess.
Thanks, Abi. That was great. Really enjoyed your talk, and I always love looking at the photographs from your project. So I'm, as before, we'll save questions for both speakers to the end, if that's okay with everyone. And I'll introduce our second speaker now. Working in rural communities, Jessica Hogan's research has often investigated conflict and coexistence. She is currently completing her PhD in the School of Geography and Sustainable Development here at the University of St Andrews, where she is investigating communities' acceptance and or opposition towards wind energy in their local areas. Her research interests include energy justice, particularly around benefits and participation, community energy, and conservation conflicts. The title of this talk is Putting Community Back into Community Energy. Does ownership affect support and perceived justice for wind energy in Scotland. And I'll pass over to Jessica now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I'll just go right into it. I'm looking forward to presenting the first chapter of my PhD research with you guys today. A big thank you to my supervisors, Dr. Charles Warren, Dr. Michael Simpson, and Dr. Darren McCauley, and as well to my funders. So energy is a fundamental part of our lives. We use it every day. Countries in the global north tend to use large amounts of energy, and the energy that we use tends to cause impacts, particularly those that are carbon intensive, such as coal. So it's become a big part of the climate change dialogue. And of the 5 campaigns discussed at COP26 this year, 2 of those focused on energy. One specifically about what's called the energy transition, stating that in order to achieve the goals set out in the Paris Agreement, we would need to transition to clean power 5 times faster than at present. But this quick move towards renewables, especially if it is wind and solar, means moving closer to where people live, and often in more locations. And with this shift, it has become clear that there are significant forms of local resistance towards wind energy projects, and in some cases it has led to delayed or completely halting projects. So to better understand opposition, researchers and policymakers have looked at a variety of reasonings. Many used to point to what's called NIMBYism, so not in my backyard, where people accept renewables generally, but opposed to projects being built in their local area. But more recently, scholars have indicated that this is too simplistic, as people may have various reasons for their oppositions. Other people, like Rodas et al., have combined many of these literatures into one framework with various risk perceptions, including the social, environmental, and economic aspects people may consider as impacts. Recently, there's been a greater shift to understand how creating a fairer, more equitable energy development may increase acceptance. In particular, there's been a push from researchers and policymakers towards something called community wind energy, as they've been seen to be more fair, provide greater benefits to local communities, and has led to greater acceptance. According to Walker and Divine Right, the ideal community wind energy project is one which is driven and carried through by local people and which bring collective benefits to the local community, or a project that is both by and for the people. In a recent review by Baxter et al. Of community wind energy research, they found that there is a clear positive link between community wind energy and social acceptance. But what they found is that there's actually limited empirical evidence explaining why this link exists in the first place. And so here we will fill this gap by testing whether different community energy projects gain similar degrees of acceptance using a mail-out survey in Scotland to local communities. And to understand possible reasons why, we compare communities' perceptions of energy justice, risk perceptions, and perceptions of benefit options. So to start, community energy has often been criticized as being ambiguous. For example, developers using the word community in such a way to gain temporary social license without actually practicing what local people may desire with that development. And so in going back to Walker and Devine's paper about the ideal community renewable energy installation, they include 2 aspects. One is process and the other is outcome. So process dimension sees community projects as needing a high degree of involvement from the local residents in planning, setting up, and potentially running the project. And then outcome focuses on the outcome and is less concerned with who is participating, but where the benefits are actually distributed. And then this third area, C, acknowledges the plurality of community energy, essentially that there's many different forms that community energy takes. And this area is for projects that are less concerned about ticking the right boxes about community energy, but that it's actually going ahead and would lead to something productive and useful. And so under this conceptualization of community energy projects, those that occur in this upper right-hand corner part of the quadrant, those would be more locally acceptable in that they have greater procedural and distributive properties, which are 2 tenets of the fundamental framework for studying energy justice. So energy justice is defined as a global energy system which fairly distributes both benefits and costs from the energy sector and makes representative and impartial energy decisions. So the most common framework to explore energy justice is the three tenets. So we have procedural justice, which explores how just the involvement is with the stakeholders and how they've been involved in this decision-making process. Then we have recognizing justice, or what we'll talk about as self-recognizing justice, as it's from the individual's perspective, is about whether an individual believes their opinions represent legitimate issues of fairness. And then the third tenet is distributional justice, and that's the quality of the distribution of benefits and or the impacts from the energy development. So energy justice has been found to be linked to community wind energy. For example, wind energy with some form of community-based ownership, either shared or community ownership, which addresses both procedural and distributional justice, have been seen as an important factor in actually increasing acceptance of wind farms. So what we saw in that top right-hand corner of that quadrant we looked at on the last slide. And so the weight of studying justice concerns alongside community energy has become noticeable in the research, but hasn't often been studied quantitatively. So my overarching aim of this research combined these literatures of community acceptance research and energy justice in order to understand the extent to which communities with differing ownership and benefits for an onshore wind project support or oppose the developments in their local areas. As I'm exploring these benefits and ownership, there's greater emphasis on distributional justice, so otherwise known as how those are fairly distributed, the benefits or the impacts. And for interest of time, I'm really going to focus on the findings for the energy justice aspects. Overall, our results support the contention that community ownership leads to greater support, but they also show that it was only one of several factors shaping public acceptance. So the case study for my research are focused in Scotland. Scotland makes a really excellent place to study because there are many examples of different forms of ownership, from fully community owned to commercial developments. There are also a lot of government support from the Scottish National Party to push for renewables. The previous First Minister even dubbed Scotland as the Saudi Arabia of renewables. So wind energy makes sense to study because it has grown so rapidly, representing the biggest single renewable technology, accounting for 71% of installed capacity. And so with great and rapid expansion, there are serious energy justice concerns for those living closest to these energy sources. And the study areas were chosen based on three different aspects. Firstly, it had to have a form of community benefit found in the Scotland's good practice principles. So the Scottish government released these practice principles with voluntary guidelines for commercial developments to help foster better relationships between developers and the community. The first one being community benefits, which suggests that each wind farm should put in about £5,000 per megawatt installed, which goes into a charity fund, and then community members can apply for this to do whatever they wanted in the community. The example we chose was up here in Caithness. The second one is shared ownership, which is when a community group invests in a commercially owned renewable energy project, for example, like a cooperative. But it also now must include community benefits. So there has to be a fund that goes back to the wider community, and the total funding that goes back to the community, whether it's through the cooperative and the community benefits, has to be the same amount as the £5,000 per megawatt installed. So the example that we chose was up here in Dunvegan on the Isle of Skye. And then the third example is actually not in the good practice principles, but fully community-owned projects are quite popular in Scotland. They're where the community fully benefits from it and is fully involved in the development. The example we chose was up on the Isle of Lewis, and that's the Point in Sandwich Trust. To answer my research questions, I implemented a survey in the Highlands and Islands in Scotland, and my overall response rate was about 39%. For mail-out surveys, which is actually quite good. For analysis, I used one-way ANOVAs, which compared group averages between the different communities. I also used what's called the potential for conflict index, to see whether there were differences between within the actual communities themselves, because communities are rarely homogeneous. So I wanted to make sure that while we're looking at differences between these different types of ownership, it's really important that we understand what's actually happening within the community itself. So overall, the one-way ANOVAs identified on average that those with community or shared ownership tended to support the wind development more, feel more involved, perceive more benefits that are fairly distributed, and perceive less risks and support their own benefit schemes. And this, our results support the contention that community ownership leads to greater support, but it shows that it is only one of several factors shaping public acceptance, as I said earlier. And so there's several important findings that that should be highlighted. Firstly, in the case of community benefits, the findings that the residents tended to have lower acceptance and energy justice generally may be unsurprising based on the differences in payments to the community. The private developer for community benefits put in the minimum required stated in the good practice principles, so £5,000 per megawatt installed, totaling about $149,500 annually. This is in stark contrast to community ownership, where the community trust contributes £750,000 more per year than community benefits, which will then increase to $2 million a year for the community when the initial costs have been paid off. What is more interesting is that the residents with full and shared ownership were similar across most statements. However, their benefits are more varied. Bulk Renewables, the developer of the shared ownership, pays less in what we call community benefits, so that's that fund that people can apply for, meaning that the general community fund is lower. However, the cooperative pays 9.1% back on investment, which is quite high. And that goes back each year to its members. And going a bit further into what the cooperative does, matching what research suggests, Bulk Renewables provides the opportunity for more of the community to invest in the project by making the investment as low as £250. Not only this, but after the wind farm is taken down, they will receive their investment back from the company. So about 25 to 30 years after they made their investment. While this might not include everyone, as not everyone can afford £250, it does increase the amount of people that would be interested in investing in the first place. And then by investing, they also get a vote for the members board, which is created of local members. They also receive advice on reducing their energy bills. And from my experience, they're really easy to get in touch with and ask questions. Bulk Renewables also created more opportunities for the involvement from the local community right from the beginning. And so before the wind turbines were actually functional, they held a competition to name the turbines, and a primary school student won and got to be there to open the ceremony when the turbines became functional. So not only did they involve the younger generation who will grow up next to these turbines, but they also created a community event for the opening. In comparison, the comments from the community members near community benefits, so this is up in Caithness, they were much more negative. For example, wind farms in Caithness are driven by greed and ignorance. Wind energy is a load of rubbish which provides limited benefit to local communities. Overly expensive wind turbines only benefit the communities and wind owners, many of whom do not live with the effects of said turbines. Community benefits are just a bribe to let planning permissions. I live and can see Stroops wind farm from my village, but my village is not in the area to benefit. Yet Dunnet and May are, and are not near the wind farm, an absolute disgrace. These are several quotes highlighting a portion of the surrounding community who feel disenfranchised from the process. There are only a few examples, but there are many more just like this. And one of the community members actually directed me to a news article in the local journal highlighting campaigns occurring in the area around wind farms. So Scottish government ministers don't care about us, says campaigner, as new map shows extent of Caithness wind farms. Therefore, it seems like there's a lack of procedural justice to understand the expectations that the communities in Caithness may actually expect from this project. And while shared ownership doesn't provide much more community benefits to the general community, they do provide benefits to the cooperative, as well as a dialogue which is transparent that is occurring that isn't necessarily occurring in Caithness, suggesting that acceptance is more than about benefits, but it's also about this process. So this kind of brings us back again to this, this diagram and their ideal form of community energies. So like we said, if we're at the top right-hand side, they would have greater support. And so what we might see is that community ownership would be close to the top right-hand, as it was perceived by the community to have both a high process and high outcome. Community benefits, while having some benefits, it is just the minimum, and the residents didn't find the benefits enough or distributed fairly and did not perceive the process as open and participatory. For shared ownership, the residents see the process as similarly open and participatory as community ownership, but community ownership provides much more monetary benefits. So it might end up being somewhere about here on the graph. However, we found that they perceived the benefits to be enough and distributed fairly, just as community ownership had. So this might suggest that if the process is open and participatory, the perceptions of that outcome being local and collective may increase, even though one project had greater outcomes for the community. Alternatively, community energy may actually exceed the community's expectations for the proposed project. For example, they may have just expected to be consulted on the project. A participatory process allows for the developer to understand what those expectations are from the community. Perhaps what we have found is that the ideal project is flexible in the context of what the community envisions for that project. And I've put a question mark here because I'm not sure. I'm just thinking through some of these possible explanations for these results. And based on these results, there's a clear need for future research to explore the connection between process and outcome to better understand this relationship. So what does this mean for policy in Scotland? The good practice principles really focus on benefits, but there needs to be greater emphasis on process and decision-making for communities in this guidelines. For example, if projects are going to continue to provide community benefits, they should be required to include justice elements, which will hopefully prevent these forms of benefits from feeling like bribery or buying acceptance. Positively, the Scottish Government has now put out the goal of half of newly consented wind farms. They must be shared ownership or some form of shared ownership. However, Folk Renewables has expressed that due to a new law, they can no longer set up the cooperatives through Energy for All and must use community benefit societies, which has meant there has been a decrease in their payments to investors on new projects. So it's not as high as 9.1%. So this may take away cooperatives' ability to create higher incentives for shared ownership, which may hinder future development. And then lastly, fully community-owned projects have had a more challenging time. For example, the government indicated a goal of 500 megawatts of community and locally owned renewables by 2020, which they indicated they surpassed in 2015. However, this count included for-profit ownership, and only 61 megawatts of the 500 were actually community owned. And as Walsh 2016 stresses, a project that has a combination of farmer and non-resident landowner participation does not automatically grant community status to a project. Applying the community label creates certain expectations regarding the form and function of the development process. This use of community and local development skews the idea of what community energy is actually meant to mean. So to conclude, we found that residents within fully community owned and shared ownership tended to be more positive towards their local wind energy project and experience greater perceived energy justice. These results from our study highlight the importance of including justice elements in the Scottish Government guidelines for commercial development, and monetary benefits are only one piece of a greater puzzle. It also should be noted that, as Warren and McFadden indicate, community energy projects are not a magic bullet and do not automatically fix the problem of opposition. Governments worldwide often focus on monetary benefits from renewables, but there needs to be a larger balance with energy justice elements to be ingrained in the planning system. Going back to the title of my presentation and thinking about putting community back into community energy, the model from Walker and Divine Right, 2008, continue to remind us that there is something significant and important about a community approach to renewable energy that is lost when projects are labeled community, but are not open and participatory as a community label presupposes. If governments and developers want to use the label community for their project, it should reflect the community's expectations of what that word means, which suggests being open and participatory from the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks again to Abi. So we can take questions now. It'd be great if we can get a nice balance of questions for both speakers. I'm not sure how we'll manage it, but we'll see how we get on and we'll try our best. There's a couple of hands up. I can think of a question at the end, but because we've got a really good turnout today, I'll save that. Perhaps there won't be time for it. Who put their hand up first? I'm so sorry, I missed that.
I think it was Richard.
Richard, cheers, Laura.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much for the very insightful presentations, Abi and Jess. I actually have a question for both of you. So I'm gonna start with my question for Jess. So about like the community engagement, in the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about like how like communities in the global north consume like most of the energy. And then in your research, you're focusing on communities in the global north as well, and like factoring in energy justice for communities and putting that back into planning. And I was wondering whether you have a discussion in your research where you talk about energy justice for people in other parts of the world and how like climate change kind of affects other communities and how energy consumptions limit opportunities for other people in different parts of the world, especially like climate refugees, for example, in other areas. So my question is it sometimes a little bit selfish that communities want to be involved and that we talk about climate justice for them while our energy consumption limits like climate options for communities in other parts of the world? So that's my question, if there's a discussion of that in your dissertation or if you have any takes on that. And then I wanted to ask Abi, when I heard your presentation about deer in Scotland, my dad is a hunter in Germany, so I'm exposed a little bit to like incidents like deer being hit by cars and he has to go out because he's called up for these kind of things. And I was wondering if there's also like how deers or animal rights are acknowledged in the Scottish law, and if you have like a discussion of like the legal frameworks of animal rights in Scotland, or if this is something which isn't regulated by law. Thank you.
Go on, Jess.
Sure. Okay. So, Richard, your question is it selfish to talk about energy within communities in the global north when there are issues in other parts of the world that also disenfranchise people from contributing to the energy? I would agree that there has been a big dialogue that happens in the global north, and there has been calls for research to happen in other parts of the world. That is a big push, and there is more research coming out currently about ways in which that can help. The issue with community energy, even within the global north, is that it usually happens in areas of higher socioeconomics. So because community energy, if it's fully owned, they have to, run the projects, they have to have that kind of expertise and all these different things, have the funding. And so often that happens in areas where, yes, higher socioeconomic areas, which in itself is an energy justice issue. And that, has been kind of talked about in the literature, thinking about how can we involve more communities in this, and that has to come through incentives for people to be able to afford that. In terms of widening it out to the greater world, there's really big issues with grid systems. So affording to expand the grid system in other areas, especially as we're decentralizing it, that would be a major issue if we're thinking about community wind energy in other parts of the world. But I don't know if that answers your question, because if we're consuming the most energy, then we should be thinking about how do we produce that energy in a more equal way. And so it would be unfair to then be like, okay, we'll put our new energy systems in another place and take that energy still. So I actually think that creating these energy communities is a fair process because it brings that energy closer to where people are using it. It just depends on how the system changes and whether or not the grid system changes with that aspect of becoming more just, if that makes sense.
Okay, and regarding my question about sort of deer rights and Scottish policy and law, so deer welfare is probably one of the main things mentioned in like Scottish Deer Acts. So there have been various deer acts. There's been the Land Reform Act as well that mentions deer, and a lot of the welfare considerations in those are to do with when deer are culled. A lot of them are to do with culling, basically. When deer are culled, what is used to cull a deer, what kind of firearm, who is doing it, and that can be to do with like closed seasons, so you're only allowed to cull deer at certain times of the year. So for female deer, it's when they haven't got a young deer fawn. Gosh, can't even remember the deer words. So there are concerns or are considerations in Scottish policy regarding that. However, I don't think there's too much necessarily about the deer welfare itself, so about like the effects of deer vehicle collisions or limits on when things would need to happen. There's no sort of thresholds for when deer management needs to occur. And the other thing is that there isn't really anything specific for urban deer, so that none of the policies specifically talk about urban deer at all. I think the thing that really needs to be considered, is there anything about who is responsible for them in case of accidents in cities? No, there is no policy on that. At the moment, it might be that the police get involved or the local council gets called, and they might call a local stalker to get involved. But at the moment, there's no framework for how that happens. I think it's also important to consider that the way deer management happens in Scotland is very different to how it happens in many other countries in Europe. So in Scotland, it's very voluntary. In other countries, it's really regulated. And the way I think deer management perceived is also very different. So here it's seen as sort of an elitist thing, whereas in other countries, everyone goes out stalking. For instance, in Norway, it's just normal. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I wondered if there might be class issues there as well, Abby. Maybe we could talk about that another time. Joseph had a question as well.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Thank you both of you. It was really interesting. My question is for Abby specifically. My question's about like your method. There were 30 local councils and you spoke to one person in each one. How much consistency did you have of like their like role within that council? And if there was like inconsistencies, has that like impacted the results, or could it impact the results? And is it something you're discussing?
Yeah, I think it's something that I would definitely write about. So there, 30 local authorities in Scotland with deer, and I spoke to one person from each of those local authorities. When I approached the local authorities, I approached the person with the job title that seemed most relevant. So like park ranger or someone in charge of biodiversity. And I did ask in those emails to be signposted to the person who would know the most about deer. But there was a clear disparity. Like some local authorities had people out managing deer. They knew so much about it, and others didn't know who to send me to because they thought, oh, maybe this roads person knows something. They might pick up deer off the road, or maybe this forester knows something. But there are definitely huge disparities in the amount of knowledge that those staff members had, and also their background. So some were very ecological, and others didn't really have that at all. So yeah, definitely something I need to consider. Right.
Wonderful. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Louise?
Okay, I can ask one. I thought those were really great presentations. Thank you both. And it's really nice to get a kind of more in-depth sense of what you've been doing, just rather than just the fringes of it. So it's been really nice to hear. I have a question, the same question for both of you. And it's going to be hard for you to answer maybe, because I want you to imagine that I'm Nicola Sturgeon. And if you were able just to say one thing to me that you think, for instance, the Scottish Government could do to implement some of the initial findings that are coming out of your work, what one thing do you think could be changed or should be changed?
I don't know if my answer would be one thing. This is the issue.
It's only one thing.
Okay. There needs to be a specific policy created to do with urban deer and how they are managed. Now, that might include many things to do with the aspects, but at the moment, there is just nothing telling anyone what to do. So Nature Scot aren't taking responsibility necessarily. Local authorities aren't doing anything. So there needs to be something in law or some sort of policy that tells people what is supposed to happen and what the correct way of doing it is.
And I was just gonna, I know it's hard to narrow it down, but I stressed process at the end of my presentation. And I think that that's a really important part of thinking about these processes and outcomes in our policy that we put out, especially when we're talking to commercial developments. That's really important for these communities. And so we really need in community energy to be thinking about those two aspects and not just the benefits, but actually what are the outcomes of that benefit and what is the process that we took to get there.
I love that question. Are there any others from the audience? Richard, go for it.
I have a question to Jess again, like now after your intervention. Also, like what I wanted to ask in the beginning, is it always about process, or like, my question is, what's bugging me, should we always need to involve the community, or is top down sometimes even like more desirable to achieve like results in energy transition that we need in the kind of scale that the climate crisis dictates? Do we always need process, or do we sometimes need just top down and make things work without involving the community?
It's a good question, because that's actually kind of the approach that's often taken, is a top-down approach. But really what's different about renewables is that they are not the same way of, it's decentralized. So we have the power kind of dynamics are being sent to the peripheries of Scotland, for example, where they used to be kind of central. And so the dynamics are changing. And I think that you can't take a top-down approach because of they're living near these, it's very different. There are lots of different reasons why people feel kind of opposition towards these wind energy. I don't think that, it's definitely not fair or in any way to just push kind of energy. I see what you're saying about, you have to meet the Paris Agreement, like I said, 5 times faster, we need to push for renewables. That's an enormous amount of energy needed. But it doesn't mean that we need to just forget about the ethics and morals that go along with creating these energy systems. And I guess the kind of dialogue that's happening is that if we're going to be transitioning, shouldn't we be making our energy system and our world a better place to live in? And so that's the question. Yeah, I don't know. Did that answer your question? I don't know if it does. It's a complicated one. Because it's very quick and fast, but I think that process is important. It's not the only aspect. I should stress that it's not the only aspect that's important, but it is, I think, getting to the rest of the issues that happen in that community starts with understanding what that community's expectations are. And that starts with process. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, in case anyone's got another meeting or anything like that to go to, we could probably wrap up there. So thanks again to Jessica and to Abi. And yeah, just to say a couple of words while we're closing. I'm so sorry that I've had to put my video off. I've got some connection issues and it's working better when it's off. We just wanted to say that we'd like to be able to run some events that are useful for the postgraduate student community. So we wanted to ask if to invite everyone to come to us with suggestions. Really, our email is CEES, so CEES @standrews.ac.uk. Be great to have your ideas. And also, if you're a postgrad and would like to give a STACEES seminar, likewise get in touch. We'll be scheduling next semester's events soon. And thanks to you all in the audience for coming, and once again to today's speaker. This is our last seminar of the calendar year, so have a great winter break, everyone, and we hope to see you at an event next semester. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.